As the funeral procession made its way to the cemetery, the young boy sat in the back of the car, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't believe that his mother was gone. He had never felt so alone in his life. When they arrived at the cemetery, the boy made his way to the front of the crowd where his mother's coffin lay. He leaned over and placed a gentle kiss on the lid, whispering his final goodbye. Then he said something that made them stop the funeral. But before we start, make sure to subscribe if you haven't and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. David had an amazing bond with his mother Haley before she died. They did everything together. Every morning, Haley and David would go on a stroll. David loved to go to a nearby park and swing for hours. David's father was not in the picture. He had left Haley just before she gave birth to David. He had never tried to contact them or get to know his son. Haley hated him for that. She never imagined her son having to grow up without a father. Rose and Haley had 4 years between them. She was very protective of her sister, being the older one. Haley could see that David loved his auntie and that they had a great bond together. So she made Rose David's godmother in her will. Rose didn't know about this, but she would soon find out. Haley's death was truly a tragedy. She died way too soon, and the whole community mourned for her. It was Wednesday, and Haley was getting ready to drop David off at her grandparents'. First, she packed his bag and got herself and David dressed. She overslept that morning and was in a hurry to get everything done in time. But while Haley was making breakfast, something horrible happened. It was time to eat breakfast. She looked for David, but he wasn't in his play corner anymore. She started to panic. She searched everywhere in the house, but he was nowhere to be found. Then she noticed something. She ran outside and started calling for David. Haley then spots David's little head in the distance. She ran as fast as she could, not looking at the cars passing. And when she had almost reached David, tragedy struck. What she feared would happen to her son had happened to her. David didn't know what was happening. His Aunt Rose had come to pick him up and had brought him to his grandparents. He had seen police cars and an ambulance, so he was very excited. He didn't understand why everyone was so sad around him and kept asking about his mother. Rose acted strong and happy around her nephew, but she was hurting inside. She had just lost her best friend, her sister. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. When Rose opened the door, her mouth fell open. Vincent was standing opposite of her and barged through the door. "Where is my son?" he said. But David was still at his grandparents' house. Rose wondered why Vincent was so keen on seeing his son. He had never cared for David, so why did he care now? "Why do you care about David all of a sudden? You have never been a father to him in the past." Rose's voice broke. She couldn't bear to argue about this now. This was the worst timing ever. She went to her grandparents' house the next day to tell them what had happened, but she heard a familiar voice when entering the house. Vincent had beaten her to it and sat on the couch in the living room. David played in front of him and smiled when he saw his auntie. "What are you doing here?" Rose asked Vincent as kindly as possible. She didn't want to upset David. Vincent told her the story he had told her parents. Rose was full of emotions. Her voice trembled. "How can you lie to my parents like that?" Rose tried her best to explain everything to her parents, but Vincent kept interrupting her. He denied her allegations, but her parents knew better. They had never trusted Vincent, so why would they now? She went to the police station the next day, but the officers told her that she needed proof. All she had now were accusations. But that wouldn't last long because Vincent was waiting for her at her doorstep when she returned. She invited him in and told him she had been to the police office today to inform them about his latest actions. Vincent turned pale as he heard the words, "police office." Rose frowned and asked him about it, but he got up and left in a hurry, not saying a word as he walked out the door. Rose hoped that would be the last she saw from him. But not a minute later, the doorbell rang again. Back aga. Rose couldn't finish her sentence because it wasn't Vincent who stood in front of her door. It was a police officer. They had looked into Vincent and found some worrying information about him. It turned out that he drove the same car as the one that had hit her sister in that freak accident. Rose couldn't believe what she was hearing. How is it possible that Haley and Vincent never spoke to each other, and yet he was the one who hit her with his car? Now that they knew who the car belonged to, they asked Rose to help them catch Vincent. She agreed, but told them she had informed Vincent about her visit to the station and doubted if he would ever return. They came up with a plan. If that were the case, the police would be informed immediately. Rose told the undertaker and her parents the plan so everyone knew what was happening. The funeral was tomorrow, and Rose really dreaded this day. She couldn't believe that this was all happening at the same time. But tomorrow would be the day everything came to an end, or at least, so she hoped. It was the morning of the funeral, and Rose was sick to her stomach. She wanted this day to be over quickly, but she also wanted to be present at the funeral and say goodbye to her sister. She met her grandparents at the cemetery and took David in her arms. They would start the ceremony by saying some words about her sister. "Yes," she replied, not knowing what to say. She noticed that David got a strange look on his face. He mumbled something Rose couldn't understand and got frustrated when she didn't do anything. David started to cry. He tried to lift himself on the edge of the coffin to look over it at his mother, so Rose picked him up again. She looked around to see if someone could help her, but no one was around anymore. She calmed David down and asked him what it was he was saying. Rose understood him clearly this time and notified the undertaker about David's findings. She knew she couldn't go through with the funeral if this wasn't resolved. Rose assured David that they would look into this and all they could do was wait now. David calmed down and they waited outside. The sun beamed over the graveyard. Normally it would rain at this time of year, but not today. Rose took this as a sign. Her sister was watching over her. A tear rolled down her cheek and David wiped it away. She looked at him and suddenly felt it was all going to be all right. The undertaker walked outside and informed her that the issue had been resolved. She walked to the casket with David in her arms and looked at her sister. She looked complete now. Rose couldn't believe David would notice such a small detail about his mother. This showed how much he loved her. David noticed that Haley wasn't wearing her necklace with her and David's initials. She had gotten that necklace from Rose after David's birth and had worn it every day since then. But the paramedics had to take it off after her accident. Luckily for Rose, someone could pick it up at the hospital. The funeral could continue, and it was a beautiful ceremony. She got buried at a nearby cemetery with a beautiful headstone, so David had a place to visit. Rose went to her parents' house afterward to pick up some of David's things and suddenly thought about Vincent. She hadn't seen him all day. Her parents told her that Vincent did show up, but the undertaker noticed this and notified the police immediately. This way, it didn't disturb the mourners and the ceremony could continue without trouble. Rose was happy to hear this. They could finally let this all behind them and get some closure.